opportunity to welcome you all to worship here on this Easter Sunday, this grand celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are glad that you have made worship a priority in your life today. We're glad that you've chosen this place to worship among us here at First Baptist Church. I know that we have many visiting with us today. We're so grateful that you're here, and we hope that you'll take just a moment to fill out one of the visitor cards that is located there in the pew in front of you, close to the Bibles and the hymnals. If you will fill that out and place that in the offering plate, when the offering plate comes by today, we would greatly appreciate it. I have a lot of announcements today. It's April Fools. I'm not going to make the announcements. I started not to make the April Fools jokes, so now I got to. I'm only going to make one announcement today. We are going to have a church work day on April 21st. It's going to start at 9 a.m. And so if you're able to help out on that day, we would greatly appreciate it. We have a wonderful crowd here today. I told David a minute ago, I can't remember the last time I was nervous standing up in front of a congregation to speak and preach. Really nervous, but man, you guys, thank you all for being here to celebrate Jesus today. We are looking forward to this. We have such a great crowd today. I'm afraid that standing up and walking around and greeting one another may be impossible. And so we hope that you have taken an opportunity to speak to your brothers and sisters in Christ today. But if you have not, we hope that at the end of the service today, you would take that opportunity. But at this time, I am simply going to say, David, will you come and lead us in worship?
I'll read the life prayer and invite you to respond with the bold and italicized text. Let's read together this morning. Alleluia, Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Alleluia.
Praise the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ.
He has given us new life and hope. He has raised Jesus from the dead.
God has claimed us as His own.
He has brought us out of darkness. He has made us light to the world.
Alleluia, Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Alleluia.
I invite you to remain standing as we sing our opening hymn this morning, Christ the Lord is risen today. We'll sing all four stanzas. You'll find the words on the screen behind me.
Alleluia.
you gave your one and only Son, that we might be called your children too. Lord, help us to live in the gladness and grace of Easter Sunday every day. Let us have hearts of thankfulness for your sacrifice. Let us have eyes that look upon your grace and rejoice in your salvation. Help us to walk in that mighty grace and tell your goodness to the world. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Gospel reading from John chapter 20, the resurrection of Jesus. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. And Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. And the disciples returned to their homes. This is the word of God, and together we respond, "Thanks be to God."
Would you stand as we sing our hymn medley this morning?
Jesus' blood and righteousness.
Would you join me in the responsive reading you'll find written on the words on the screen? I'll read the live print and invite you to respond with the bolded text. Hear these words based on John 3:16 and 17. God, we come before you longing to believe the truth of the resurrection.
Help us to believe.
As we go through our world, as we encounter the wrong, hate, evil, and cruelty towards each other, help us to look to your example of love through Jesus. Even for those who do not yet believe,
let us strive to point towards eternal life in you through your light in our lives.
For God so loved the world
that he gave his only Son,
so that everyone who believes in him
may not perish, but may have eternal life.
Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world,
but in order that the world might be saved through him.
Amen. Would you stand as we sing our offertory hymn this morning, Crown Him with Many Crowns.
Thank
thank you for your holy sacrifice, for the timeless price you paid for us. We thank you for these moments of joy as we look over the brittle palm leaves to the lilies of the resurrection. May we look again at the gifts of the last few days. We gave you our hollow hosannas. You gave us a jubilant eternity. May we look at this day and the gifts we can offer after the morning's day glow. Let us bring our offerings, sing our anthems, ring the gilded bells. Let us find more ways to love, more means to service, more desire to contribute to our world and to your kingdom. Grant us your blessings over all these things and over us. Hallelujah. Thine the glory. Hallelujah.
Amen.
just going to cut to the chase. It's Easter Sunday. We're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. We're celebrating the greatest single event that's in human history that's ever happened, period. And so I'm just going to cut to the chase. Today I'm going to do three things. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to narrate to you the basic facts about what happened to Jesus on Friday and Sunday. The second thing I'm going to do is we're going to look together at John 20, at Jesus' appearance to his disciples, and then to Thomas. And Thomas' response to the disciples' report, and then his response to the risen Jesus. And finally, at the end today, I'm going to come back and draw out three basic points of application for us today here on this Easter Sunday. So first, just the facts. Like Joe Friday, just the facts, man. And the first fact of Easter is that on that Friday, Jesus died. That is an irrefutable, indisputable fact. Believe it or not, there are those who for years and still today advance the notion that Jesus did not die. That he only swooned. That he appeared to be dead, but he wasn't really dead, and his disciples nursed him back to health. But I want you to consider the facts. Dr. Alexander Methrel, MD and PhD, is an expert in the field. He has studied every bit of historical, archaeological, and medical data that he can get his hands on regarding the crucifixion process, and specifically the crucifixion of Jesus. I will spare you some of the more graphic details, but if you ever find a copy of a little book called The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel, he's got a great little interview with Dr. Methrel in there. Basically, it's this. The experts, the Romans, had become experts. They had perfected the fine art of torturing and killing people via crucifixion. The process of crucifixion was so brutal, so horrible, so unthinkable, that we had to invent a brand new word to describe the pain inflicted by crucifixion. Have you heard the word excruciating? We talk about excruciating pain. That's the word they had to invent to describe how horrible crucifixion was. There was no word in their language that could possibly describe the awfulness of this kind of death. So they came up with a new word, excruciating, which literally means out of the cross. And this is the kind of torture and death the Romans subjected Jesus to. I'm not even going to talk about what they did to people before they crucified him. But it was horrible. And many times people died before they ever made it to the cross because the process was so horrible up to that point. But once they got ready to nail Jesus to that cross, they stretched his arms out and they drove a nail through about right here and right here on either side. That was considered part of the hand in their way of thinking. But it pinched the nerve. Think about how bad it hurts when you hit your funny bone down here. That's when you hit a nerve. Think about a nail going through here, a spike, and staying on that nerve. And then they raised them up. Well, actually next they would drive a nail through the top of the feet as well. And then they raised them up. And the shoulders would stretch about 6 inches immediately. Both shoulders would come out of joint. And the prisoners who were there crucified, they had to push up with their feet in order to breathe, because of the pressure and the stress it put on their body. You can imagine the pain. And they had to struggle to breathe as a process of pericardial effusion and pleural effusion took place. As fluid built up around the heart and the lungs, they would typically die slowly of asphyxiation because of this fluid buildup as they struggled to breathe more and more. It was typically a slow process, but in the case of Jesus, it happened fairly quickly, most likely because of the severe trauma his body had already been inflicted earlier. He was in such critical condition when they ever put him on the cross. Dr. Methrel said, at this point, a person's breathing will slow down. And they go into something called respiratory acidosis. The acidity of the blood rises as carbon dioxide builds up in the bloodstream, and it causes an erratic heartbeat. And he says that Jesus would have known. Jesus would have recognized this, that he was at the moment of death because of the irregular heartbeat. And that is when he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Jesus saw this. He knew this. And he died. I keep in mind this all happened on Friday. The Jewish Sabbath began at sundown on Friday. And it was against Jewish custom and Jewish law to leave Jews hanging on a cross through the Sabbath. And so, to speed up the process, the Roman soldiers would go and they would break the legs of the men crucified so they could no longer push up and breathe, and it would speed up the ensuing death. They did this to the criminals on Jesus' right and left, but when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. But just to make sure, keep in mind, they were experts. They knew what they were doing. Just to make sure, they took a spear and they ran it between his ribs and pierced his heart and his lungs. And at that point, this fluid that had built up around the heart and the lungs came out, and it appeared white or clear. And it was mixed with blood, and that is why the Gospels say that water and blood flowed from his side. So all this happened, and there's no way Jesus could have survived this. No possible way. Furthermore, no Roman soldier ever would have allowed a victim of crucifixion to survive. Why? Because if they had, it was their neck on the line. They were experts. They knew what they were doing. There was no way Jesus survived this crucifixion. Jesus died. That's a fact. Here's another fact. That was Friday. On Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. That's a fact. On Sunday morning, there was no one there. All four gospel accounts tell us that people went to the tomb looking for the body of Jesus, but when they arrived, it was not there. It was gone. You know, some have tried to argue that the disciples came in and they stole Jesus' body. I think about that and said, well, that's okay, but if that's the argument, then you have to admit the tomb was empty. Well, that's actually the arguments the very early opponents made against the Christian movement. If you read in Matthew's Gospel, it says, you go and you tell everybody that the disciples stole the body. I say, there's no way. There's no way. Because there were Roman guards there at the tomb. There's no way the disciples of Jesus could have overpowered those guards and taken and stolen the body of Jesus. Furthermore, later, the disciples put their necks on the line. They were willing to lay down their lives for the message that Jesus had risen from the dead. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't die for something you knew was a lie. And if you had stolen his body, you would know it was a lie. You would not lay down your life and be willing to die for something you knew was a lie. So the simple fact is, that day, on Sunday, the tomb was empty. Two irrefutable, indisputable facts. Jesus died on Friday, and on Sunday, the tomb was empty. However, an empty grave alone does not a resurrection make. Which leads us to the third fact, that Jesus appeared to many of his followers after he was crucified and buried. You know, less than 20 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, a man named Paul wrote a letter to a church in a city called Corinth. And in that letter, he said to them in the 15th chapter, what I received, I passed on to you. What I received, I passed on to you. This is about 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And he lists four things. And remember just the facts. Number one, Jesus died. Number two, Jesus was buried. Number three, Jesus rose again on the third day. And number four, Jesus appeared to many of his followers. He says, these are things I received and I passed on to you. He then goes on to say that Jesus appeared to Cephas, that's Peter. Then he says to the 12, that's all the apostles. Then he says that Jesus appeared to more than 500 of his followers at the same time. Then he says he appeared to James, and then he says again he appeared to all the apostles once more. Paul's writing this is about 20 years after the crucifixion. But he says, what I received, I passed on to you. So when he's writing this, he has already passed it on. The first time he was in Corinth, spreading the gospel and planting the church there. So you got to back it up about 5 years to say about 15 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. But then he said, I received it. Well, when did he receive it? Most serious New Testament scholars say he received it when he went to Jerusalem and he met with Peter and James and the other apostles. Less than 10 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. All that to say, there is no way this would have had time to become a legendary embellishment. It's a tradition that originates so soon after the events of Good Friday and Easter Sunday. There's just no way they could have made this up in that amount of time. And that doesn't even begin to take into account what we find in Matthew, Luke, and John. These three Gospels list at least 9 separate instances where Jesus appears to his followers after he's been crucified. Just the facts. I told you I was just going to give you the facts. It's just the facts that Jesus died, that the tomb was empty, and that Jesus appeared to his followers after the crucifixion. That's just the facts. And if those things are true, then in my mind there's only one possible explanation to explain how those things happened. Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. Jesus was resurrected, and yet skeptics will say, yeah, but you got all that from the New Testament. You got all that from the Bible. I mean, how can you really trust the authors of the Bible? Weren't they incredibly biased? I love what F.F. Bruce said in response to that. He said, if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt. Because there are so many independent witnesses in the New Testament bearing witness to the resurrection of Jesus. I also love what British historian Brooke Westcott had to say. He said, if you link all the evidence together, it is not too much to say that there is no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. It's just a fact. Jesus died. Jesus was buried. Jesus rose again. Those are the facts. Now look with me here at John chapter 20. As we think about one of these resurrection appearances of Jesus, in those first 10 verses we heard Stephanie read earlier. Then in verses 11 through 18, Mary Magdalene stays there at the tomb and Jesus appears to her. She thinks he's the gardener, but when he says Mary, she recognizes and realizes it's Jesus. But I want you to look with me beginning in verses 19 and 20. This is when Jesus appears to the larger group of disciples. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, it says, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. After he had said this, he showed them his hands and side. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. So prior to this, they're scared. They're huddled together behind locked doors because they're afraid for their lives. But once they see the risen Christ, they are overjoyed. Everything changes. Now skip down to verse 24. We get to read about this guy we so often call Doubting Thomas. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, which means twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believing. I find it interesting. We don't have a record of Thomas actually doing those things. He just sees Jesus. And in verse 28, Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. We always call him Doubting Thomas. Personally, I think the guy gets a bad rap. I really do. You read back earlier, Thomas is the one who says, you know what? Even if you have to go and die, we'll die with you. He's very heroic, very brave, but in this one, because of this one instance, we call him Doubting Thomas. But I want you to think about what actually took place. So Jesus shows up on Sunday evening, shows himself to all the other apostles. Thomas is not there. We don't know where he was. But he wasn't there with everyone else when Jesus shows up the first time. And all Thomas really wants is the same evidence the other guys got. I mean, is that really too much to ask when you think about it? He's not being unreasonable. And if you keep in mind, none of them believed either until they saw Jesus. The women had come back and told them Jesus is alive, but none of them believed until that they were huddled behind locked doors, scared to death until they got to see Jesus. That's all Thomas wants. I just want the same thing you guys got, and I'll believe. So in my mind, his request is definitely not unreasonable. After all, stop and think, this is resurrection we're talking about. This is someone coming back to life after being crucified. If this is true, it's a game changer. It changes everything. So yeah, you can understand he wants some evidence. Notice here in verse 25 what Thomas says. Well, first notice what he does not say. Thomas does not say flat out, no way, under no circumstances will I ever believe. Thomas does not say that. He says, he doesn't say, I will not believe, period. He said, unless I see, unless I have some evidence, some proof, something, then I will not believe. Thomas is not being hard-headed. He's not just being stubborn. Thomas is a lot like some of us. He just needs a little convincing. I like Thomas. The more I read about Thomas and study about Thomas, I like Thomas. I really do. In many ways, I can identify with Thomas, and maybe you can too. First of all, Thomas was the kind of guy who'd never say he believed something when he didn't really believe it. Well, yeah, I believe that. Yeah, sure do. He would never say that. And you know what? I think that's a pretty admirable quality to have. He's not going to give empty phrases and empty professions of things that he does not believe. I was thinking about a guy, it's 10 years ago this past week. We were out in the community of Henleyfield, Mississippi, inviting people to church. And we went to this older man's home, lived in the community, and I invited him to church on Easter Sunday. And he said, "Preacher, I'll be there." Here I stand 10 years later, and I'm still waiting for him to show up. And he's not here today. Thomas would not have done that. Thomas would have just said, "No, I won't be there." And I like that. I like that honesty that says, you know what? If I can't say that I fully believe it, I'm not going to say I believe it. If I can't say, yes, 100% sure I'm going to do it, I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to do it. I like that. I like that about Thomas. But there's something else about Thomas that I really, really like. It's that once Thomas became convinced, he was all in. Once Thomas became convinced, he put his hand to the plow and never looked back. Look there in verse 28. After Jesus says, "Thomas, come here. Feel where the nails were. Feel where the spear went." What does Thomas say to him? "My Lord and my God." Do you know that is the highest praise, the highest acclamation anyone makes about Jesus in any of the four Gospels? My Lord and my God. He's all in. There's no doubt about it. And you know, legend has it, though we have no way of confirming it, that Thomas later traveled to India. And that he spread the gospel to India. And that he started churches in India. Again, we cannot confirm that. But we do know there is a church in South India known as the Thomist Church. Thomist. And they claim to be descended from the witness of the Apostle Thomas. William Barclay said there's something very lovable and very admirable about Thomas. He said faith was never an easy thing for Thomas. Thomas was the man who had to be sure. Thomas was the man who had to count the cost. But once he was sure, and once he had counted the cost, Thomas was the man who went to the ultimate limit of faith. He said, "A faith like Thomas's is better than any glib profession. I like Thomas. I like that he was willing to face his doubts and name his doubts. I like that he was willing to wrestle with those doubts. I like that he was willing also, though, to settle his doubts and be convinced once he was presented with evidence. But most of all, I like that once Thomas became convinced of the proof of the resurrection, he was all in. That he put his hand to the plow and never looked back. Now, I told you I was going to draw out 3 basic points at the end, points of application for us. Here they are. Number 1, if you have doubts, know that you're in good company. It's Easter Sunday. We're here. We're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. But maybe you're sitting out there and you're thinking, yeah, I really don't know about all this. I mean, I'm here, but I'm here because my spouse wants me to be here. Or I'm here because my mama wants me to be here. I'm here because it's Easter and people expect me to be here on Easter. And I just couldn't say that I'm really fully convinced, Pastor. Well, guess what? If that's you and if you have doubts, you're in good company. Because Thomas traveled with Jesus for 3 years. With his very own eyes, he witnessed Jesus do things that will blow your mind, that cannot be explained in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And yet, when it came to the resurrection of Jesus, Thomas doubted. And he needed to be convinced. So if you have doubts today, know that you're in good company. But also, number 2, if you have doubts, please be willing to hear the evidence. And be willing to be convinced. That's, to me, what sets Thomas apart from some people who have doubts. Thomas was willing to accept the evidence and become convinced of the resurrection of Jesus. I mentioned Lee Strobel earlier. He's one of my favorite writers. I love the things that he writes and the things that he does. He's an investigative journalist. He's trained. That's what he does. He has training in his whole life. He learned how to dig into things and investigate them and write about them. He used to be an atheist. When he was an atheist, his wife became a Christian. And he said, oh, no. And he decided to take all of his skills as an investigative journalist and pour them into disproving the claims of Christianity. Specifically and most importantly, disproving the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. He think if I can just convince her that all this is a bunch of hogwash, we can go back to living the life we were living. So, that's what he did. Every day. He poured himself into this. And he dug and he dug and he dug and he dug until finally, guess what happened? He dug so much that he became convinced that Jesus really was raised from the dead. And he gave his life to Christ. He was willing to see the evidence and hear the evidence. And he was willing to be convinced. And he gave his life to Christ. And then, now, Lee Strobel takes all of his skills as an investigative journalist and uses them to promote the cause of Christ. Thomas was willing to be convinced. Lee Strobel was willing to be convinced. But with some people, it's like talking to that wall over there. You can present them with all kind of evidence, but it doesn't change a thing. Please don't be one of those people. Refusing to be convinced doesn't make you an intellectual giant. It makes you a stubborn old goat. Be willing to hear and see the evidence. And if there's good evidence, be willing to be convinced by that evidence. If you have doubts, you're in good company. But if you have doubts, be willing to sort through the evidence and face the evidence and deal with the evidence and be convinced. Finally, if you've already become convinced, and if you've already encountered the risen Jesus, then let your life be proof of his resurrection. The most powerful proof of the resurrection of Jesus is the transformation that takes place in the lives of his followers. In my mind. Consider those disciples locked in a room, scared to death. Not knowing what to do. Fast forward 50 days, and here they are. They are bold, even aggressive in promoting the faith. They have no fear. They refuse to be intimidated. They boldly face ridicule, imprisonment, torture, and death, but they will not back down. What happened? Or take Paul. Paul himself. What was Paul doing by his own admission? Paul was opposed, adamantly opposed to anything and everything Christian. And by his own admission, he said, I persecuted people of the way, the Christians. He said, I bound them in chains and I drugged them back to Jerusalem to be punished. Fast forward a few years, we find this same man traveling the known world, telling people about Jesus and starting churches. What happened? We know what happened. The disciples, Paul, they met the risen Christ. And it changed them. It changed them completely. And it changed them forever. Jesus transformed the lives of his earliest followers. Jesus continues to transform the lives of his followers today. If you know someone who genuinely needs a good academic, intellectual argument supporting the resurrection of Jesus, let me know. I've got some great resources and I can point you in the right direction. But at the same time, I'm thoroughly convinced that the most powerful evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is the authentic transformation that takes place in the lives of the followers of Jesus when they encounter the risen Christ. We're going to have a time of invitation today. David and our musicians are going to come and lead us. And as we close this service, I simply want to extend to you an invitation, a very simple invitation. I invite you to accept the facts about Jesus. That he died for your sins, that he was buried, and on the third day he rose from the grave. I invite you to accept those facts. And if you're willing to accept those facts and be convinced of those things, then I'm going to invite you to do one more thing. I'm going to invite you to come forward and ask Jesus Christ to come into your heart and to be your Savior and your Lord. And if you're willing to do that today, then when we stand to sing, I'm going to ask you to come forward. I'll be standing right here in front of this communion table. You may have other decisions today. Maybe you need to rededicate, recommit your life to the Lord. Maybe you know you need to let your life be proof of the resurrection of Jesus more. So take this time to pray about that and recommit yourself to that. Finally, if you're ready to become a member of First Baptist Church, we invite you to come as we all stand together and sing.
Love
see it. Just this cozy in here. Next Sunday. Thank you again for being here. Would you bow with us? Father, we thank you for this glorious day. We thank you most of all for the resurrection of Jesus. That death has been defeated. That it does not have the final word. Resurrection is the final word. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving us hope. Thank you for giving us joy. Thank you for giving us life and love and grace. Bless each one. I pray that today would be a day of rest and peace and happiness. In Christ's name. Amen.
Please be seated.
Thank you.